Hello, and welcome to A Teacher Handbook, Effective Teaching Tips for the Reading and Writing Music Notation Book 1 by Marilyn Lowe. My name is Sarah Boyd, and I'm excited to share with you what I've learned both through practice with my students and through research in notational audiation. A little bit about myself. I have a master's degree in music education from Eastern Michigan University, where I studied with Dr. Heather Schuldeis of the Everyday Musicality podcast. I've completed level 1 certification from GIML in both early childhood and piano level 1. And I have been using Music Moves as my primary curriculum since 2010 in my piano studio, which was the year where I met Marilyn Lowe at Eastern Michigan. Today, we will cover 5 reading and writing teaching tips to help lead you and your students through the reading and writing book. These include knowing the type of learning that is included in the book and knowing how to sequence the book, understanding how you can use learning just one thing at a time on the page, understanding the difference between staff and sound notation, knowing what you can do to go deeper on the page, and then finally some scheduling ideas for how to fit this in to your lessons. Marilyn wrote in the front of the book, "Rhythm and tonal patterns give meaning to music and are the building blocks for developing audiation, musicianship, and music literacy." Now, I didn't quite understand that the patterns my students would begin reading and writing were the same patterns that we had listened and sung and created with when I began Music Moves. It took me a little while to figure this out. So, just to encourage you, the patterns your students are listening and then singing and creating with, their pattern vocabulary, those familiar patterns, which you want them to know in familiar order, will be the patterns that they write down, also in familiar order. So what you're doing right now is going to strengthen the reading and writing book. Let's get started. Teaching tip 1 is to clarify the learning category. There are 3 types of learning categories involved in the reading and writing book, and they are not necessarily sequenced. So it very much behooves the teacher to know which type of learning they are utilizing for the student to make them the most successful they can be. The book can begin with the emergent music literacy activities. Just like a child is immersed in words of their culture, where they see them on road signs, in print at the library, in restaurants, a Music Moves student can be immersed in notation and slowly bring awareness to the notation and recognize that that notation has meaning. So just like a child before they are reading is aware of the words around them and they are aware that the words have meaning, the Music Moves student can do the same thing with music notation. So in the book, the student first completes section 1 and section 6. Section 1 involves creating shapes with note parts and drawings with note parts and music notes. And section 6 involves creating shapes on the staff with different intervals on lines and spaces, and then with triads on lines and spaces. And this can be done far before they get to the point where they are reading and writing their familiar tonal patterns and rhythm patterns. Next, a student is in discrimination learning in the reading and writing book. Discrimination learning is when a teacher is modeling and guiding the student and teaching them the answer. So this happens through copying tonal and rhythm patterns in the book, writing down familiar patterns from their audiation, and then finding familiar patterns in notation. All of these activities are led by the teacher, and the teacher guides the student to the answer instead of allowing the student to try and guess or teach themselves. Finally, there are inference activities in the book. These activities are allowing the student to take what they know and make new inferences to build new knowledge. Students create and then notate their own rhythm chants. They find unfamiliar patterns in notation, and they also notate created melodies. Teaching tip 2 is to do one thing at a time on the page. With rhythm, we want to remember that sections 2, 3, 4, and 5 of the book focus on rhythm patterns. So while you are in these sections with your students, don't expect them to read tonally or melodically, and focus on just the rhythm understanding. There is a step on these examples in the rhythm section, as shown here on the slide, where it says number 7, play the example. You can see it right there. How do we play the example if we have not read tonally yet? Well, this can include playing the rhythm pattern on one key. The student has already chanted the pattern and audiated the pattern, so they can play it on one key. They can create with a pattern on any keys. The student can chant the top staff while the teacher chants the bottom staff in ensemble, and then they can switch. And finally, the teacher could play the piece while the student moves to macro and micro beats. And in the future, you can spiral back to this page once the student has experience with reading tonally and they are ready to braid the two together for melodic reading. And when they are ready, they can read the full notation. But until then, you can just focus on rhythm. For tonal, when we want to focus one thing at a time, we can remember that sections 7 and 8 of the book focus on familiar tonal patterns and unfamiliar tonal patterns. We want to remember to be in discrimination learning in this section. So that means we're still guiding the student to the answer. We are modeling doing the activity first, and then they complete the activity. For example, they're reading the familiar patterns first, and then they are copying them down. And if they are working with an example like the page that is shown, we want the student to be able to read the patterns in the same key as the notation example before they try to find patterns in that notation. So for example, let's take a look a little further at the top line, the moderato example by Turk. If I was leading a student through completing the steps to do the top line, moderato by Turk, where do is C, I would refer a student to page 53 of the reading and writing book and have them find the picture where it shows do is C. Then I would have them notice that all of the note heads are stacked with low C, bass C, middle C, treble C, high C, just the note head. And I would have them take that stack of do's, as we call it, and draw it at the beginning of the line. Away from this page, on perhaps a magnet board or a staff, just a piece of staff paper or a whiteboard, I would draw out familiar tonic and dominant patterns and have the student read them after I read to them, have them copy some of them down perhaps, and I would do those patterns in the same register as the example. After that preparation, then the student can go back to the book with the moderato example by Turk, and they can look for just tonic patterns, have them sing the tonic pattern and perform it. Then they can look across the line for just dominant patterns and do the sing and perform step. And then they can look for just stepwise patterns. After they've done those, then they can copy down those patterns that they found and circled, perhaps on magnet board or whiteboard or on staff paper. Teaching tip 3 is to remember there's a difference between staff notation and sound notation. Sound intervals are different than staff intervals. 2 or 3 staff intervals may look the same, but sound different because of context. And so the key here is context and helping our students realize that something perhaps looks exactly the same, but until we check the do signature and we realize what tonality we are in, we will not know what it sounds like. Now, staff notation, like we talked about, that's a part of emergent music literacy. So that's in section 6, and it's students playing with intervals and triads. And it's a readiness for sound notation. The student first is introduced to sound notation when they go to the pages which introduce the do and la signatures, page 47 and 53. And the first sound notation a student writes down is when they begin to stack those those note heads that show the resting tone, do or la. And those are shown at the bottom of those pages, 47 and 53, those stacks of do. So the first sound notation begins with the resting tone stacks, and then the sound and staff notation is compared side by side. The student has activities to do that on page 52 and 58. And this is where the student realizes that although the intervals might look exactly the same all the way across the line, they each sound different because they are truly focusing in on the tonality and the keyality. Teaching tip 4 is how to go deeper on the page. And we want to know how to use this book to its fullest, which means perhaps having a teacher version of the book where you can copy extra pages, where your student has a book, but the teacher has an additional book, and they might make copies for the student. That's what I do in my own studio. So I'll copy pages after my student has already completed the book. Perhaps I'll copy, for example, page 15 for the student to write additional rhythm patterns from audiation. Or I might copy down page 49 to have them write their familiar tonal patterns in unfamiliar order. Or on a different page, their familiar rhythm patterns in unfamiliar order. Familiar patterns in unfamiliar order is a key to moving towards unfamiliar patterns. So you have some ideas here of what pages you could copy and how you could use them with a new activity, whether it's unfamiliar order or taking dictation, for example. And then you also can go deeper on the page by applying the checklist. So we all know and love the checklist if we've seen the student books. And our students are hopefully familiar with doing a checklist and using many different types of practicing the same song. So maybe they're doing the melody in the right hand, then the melody in the left hand, and then in a new key. Those same activities can be applied to the notation examples when the student learns the notation in the book. Teaching tip 5 are creative scheduling ideas for the reading and writing activities. So we all know that a Music Moves lesson can include so many different parts, and it can be hard to know where a reading and writing activity will fit because a lesson already has so many other different materials and steps that all support audiation-based learning. 3 ideas I have are to do a module, an intensive, or a book club. A module means that you'll focus on reading and writing for the majority of the lesson portion for a student for maybe 3 or 4 weeks. And during that time, the student will play review pieces and make changes to their review pieces, making medleys or mashups, playing them in new keys and tonalities. But the majority of the lesson time would be spent in the book with the activities. During this time, of course, the student is still moving and singing, but it's using the book's material. Another idea could be to do an intensive where students meet 5 or 7 or even more days in a row, perhaps once a day if it's in person, or maybe even twice a day if it's online. And a student that's meeting in a group with other students who are also working on the same part of the book. And so this teacher has lesson plans where they're going to lead the student through different sequences in the book over the course of those 5 or 7 days. For my studio, I've hosted a reading and writing book club that mainly meets in the summertime. We meet for 90 minutes, at least 6 times in the summer, and then throughout the year, we usually meet about once a month. And so it's just an outside of the lesson time activity, and students are able to completely focus on the reading and writing book. Plus, it's fun that it's in a book club, it's with other students. And yes, we do include snacks. So you can add an element of fun to the book when you bring students together. And that's the picture that is shown here on the slide. It's a picture of the Reading and Writing Book Club. So just to review, we went over the categories in the book. We went over doing one thing at a time, the difference between staff and sound notation, ideas to go deeper on the page, and ideas for scheduling how to fit in reading and writing activities in your studio. Thank you so much for joining me for this webinar. There are ways to learn further. I will be hosting a future series coming soon focused on the reading and writing book using first step readiness for the book, activities you can do before you get to the book, how to teach rhythm with the reading and writing book, and then how to teach tonal patterns with the book. And we want to invite you to join our Facebook group. It's called Introduction to Audiation and Music Moves for Piano. And we also want to lead you and guide you to look at the Music Learning Academy website, which is shown here on this slide. We'd love to hear questions that you can post in the Facebook group and continue this conversation. Thanks so much.